Ruthless Compassion is a podcast about people who've turned their emotional shit into fertilizer for success. It's about seeing our darkest moments as opportunities for growth and transformation. Allyson G. Harrison is a clinical psychologist currently employed as the clinical director of the Regional Assessment and Resource Center at Queen's University. She also holds an appointment as an associate professor in the Department of Clinical Psychology at Queen's University. Her research is dedicated to issues of differential diagnosis of neurodevelopmental disorders and the cognitive effects of mental health conditions. Welcome, Allyson Harrison, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Thank you. It's very nice to be back, Marcia.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have you back because at the end of our last conversation, you were talking about how moved you are these days, but not necessarily moved in a good way, about the state of mental health in the youth. And I thought that since that's a topic I've been very interested in and I've written on quite a lot, I thought it would be great to have a conversation with you today about that, especially in the light of this pandemic and the increased stress on everyone, including young people. I thought it would be really helpful to get your insights on this issue.
Yes, sure.
So first of all, tell the audience a little bit again about you and who you are, what you do, so they're reminded.
Sure. I'm a clinical psychologist and I work at Queen's University. I'm an associate professor there, and I also run a government-funded assessment center that provides assessment services and resources to students all across Ontario who suspect they may have or previously been identified as having some type of neurologically based disability.
So when you say a neurologically based disability, what examples would you give of that?
So learning disabilities, problems like dyslexia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, concussions. More and more we're getting students coming thinking they have autism spectrum disorder. So those types of more invisible disabilities that are felt to have a neurological basis.
Okay. So in general now, I was really curious because you had mentioned it, what you're seeing and what's the population, the age group that you're dealing with, and what you're seeing in terms of mental health in this population these days.
The age group that we see are anywhere between 17 to typically 30, because we get undergrad students and graduate level students as well. And what we're seeing, and it mirrors the information that's come from national surveys of students in colleges and universities, is that there's been an overwhelming increase in anxiety, depression, and rates of self-harm in teenagers and emerging adults. And it's quite frightening. And the data certainly shows that this, while it's impacted both sexes, it's affecting girls more than it is affecting boys. I mean, there's been a 77% rise in suicide rates in teenage girls. And even in young teens, it's 151% compared to sort of 2000s.
That's really frightening. What do you think is going on here?
Well, everything that I've read says it's not just one thing that's causing it. It's sort of a confluence of a number of different things. There's a fabulous book by Jean Twenge called iGen, and it's all about not only her hypothesis, but the research she's done looking at why she thinks there's this rise in mental health problems in teens and young adults. And she certainly puts some of the blame on the fact that these are kids who, the first generation of kids who had electronic devices pretty much since they've been in the crib. And that she talks about all the research saying that the more time you spend on electronic devices, especially social media, the greater your chance of having mental health problems, especially for young girls. So she says that the problem with social media, girls, unlike boys, if they're mad at you, they have a fight, they're physical, they they punch you, they get mad at you, but then it's over. Girls really like relational aggression. So now with social media, they can get at you by spreading false rumors, by taking pictures showing that you weren't there at the party they were there at, by cyberbullying, and also just by curating the pictures they show to make you feel like you're not as pretty, you don't have as many friends. And so she certainly says that that's one piece.
That's a kind of a horrifying thing to think that young girls are causing each other so much harm.
Yeah, well, girls, I think that's why there have been so many movies and books about mean girls. And again, it's not that all girls are like that, but if you're spending most of your time online rather than in person with other people, then it's easy to start believing that's true and feeling like you're left out and nobody cares about you. And we've certainly seen lots of examples in the media in the last few years about girls who committed suicide and looking at the tweets and the posts that had been sent to them, telling them how useless they were and how they should just kill themselves. That's awful. And certainly the research suggests that the more that teens and young adults are engaged in real live human interactions and doing real life things like sports, like being involved in clubs or the community, the more they're protected against that sort of negative influence. But more and more, that generation are becoming very insular, and they spend almost all their time online and on social media. And that's a whole other story, but I also think that's why the pandemic has been particularly hard for them, because at least before there was something else happening in their life saying, sorry, you got to put your phone away. Sorry, you can't be surfing the net or on Instagram or Snapchat 24/7. And now they're in their room supposed to be doing their schoolwork online, and they're with the most highly addictive device known to man at their disposal all the time, with no one setting limits. And these, in general, this is a group of kids who never learned how to set limits on themselves anyway, because their parents always did it for them.
So I'm going to talk to you now about that, about limit setting and parents, doing things for the children, because I know that that's something you that you really have been thinking about a lot.
Yes. So what I see and what the literature talks about is that parents these days, they don't want to say no to their kids. They want to be their kids' friends. And as my mother always said to me, my job is not to be your friend. You'll have lots of friends in your life. My job is to make you a competent, capable, functional individual who can still keep going once I'm no longer here. But you've got parents who, in many cases, waited until they were older to have kids. They've put a lot of, they have a lot of emotional investment in these kids. And like most things, their intentions were good, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. They don't want to set limits on their kids. They don't want to say no. And so then what happens is that these kids don't ever have somebody setting limits or boundaries for them to say, sorry, that's not acceptable. Sorry, you're part of this family. You also have to help clean up or do these things. And that's how kids, like young kids, need someone to set limits. That's what helps them feel safe. And even though they're going to buck against it and push against it, once they know that there are certain limits on what they can do, research shows those are kids who actually feel much safer and much more confident, because they know that, wow, okay, within these boundaries, if I do something that's going to put me at risk, I know someone will jump in and save me, but I know I'm safe. But if you don't have those limits, what happens is you get kids who become anxious, and not saying that people are like dogs, but if you look at dogs need an alpha. They need someone who they know is in charge. And if you take away that alpha, they become very anxious and distraught, and they have trouble with self-regulating and self-soothing. And children are the same way. And children can't learn how to self-regulate unless someone first does that for them and models it for them, and then gives them the freedom to start learning how to do that on their own.
It's so funny when you say, kids aren't like dogs, but I remember in the past watching those shows, those, Nanny 911 kind of shows, and then the dog training shows. And the thing that made me laugh is that the nanny and the dog trainer were doing pretty much exactly the same thing, which is basically teaching the parents or the owners how to set limits and have, calm authority and to create structure and order. So it was really the same training. So even though, there were obviously differences between children and animals, the trainers were doing you could have had the nanny going to the dogs and the dog trainer going to the families, and it would have been just fine, right?
I cannot agree with you more on that one. And I've seen, probably like you, I've seen families, I've been in dining rooms where the parents don't set limits and the kids are running all over the place, and these kids haven't learned how to self-regulate and sit still even through 5 minutes of a dinner. And parents who say, okay, I'm going to count to 3, 1, 2. Now I'm going to count to 3. So come back here. 1, 2. I mean, I jokingly say to my friends, this is what's responsible for the math crisis we've got right now, is these kids never learned how to count. But you're quite right that really the Nanny 911 and the dog shows, a lot of the times the problem with the kids is actually the parents aren't being parents. I have a daughter who's an occupational therapist who fell in love with an Australian and moved to Australia, and she's working in a child and adolescent mental health center, dealing with kids who are being brought in by their parents who have behavior problems or anxiety or depression. And after about a month of being there, she called me up and she said, Mom, I don't know what I should do. She said, I've got all these kids being brought in who've got serious mental health problems and behavior problems. But when I meet with them and I meet with the parents, it's pretty clear to me that the problem is the parents. And I said, yes. She said, well, what do I do? Because the parents don't want to do anything. They don't want to change. They just want me to fix their kid. But if I put them back with their parents, their problems aren't going to go away. And I said, well, darling, if you figure that one out, you will make a fortune.
Yeah, it's true. It's like the parents are making all the mistakes, but they're not willing to take responsibility for what they've created.
Yeah. And again, it comes from a place of love. And I think it also comes from a place of fear. I think that parents know that the world has changed since they were kids, and they're worried about their kids' ability to function in the world and to be successful. And for better or worse, because of social media and instant information in the internet, we hear about one-off horror story cases of things that happen to kids. But in fact, the world is a much safer place for kids now than it ever was in the 70s or 80s. I mean, the rates of even child abuse or child injury that wasn't caused by a parent have plummeted even since the 90s. And I guess what I feel so badly about is I think parents have protected and coddled their kids because they're so afraid of what's going to happen to them outside of the world. And what they don't realize is actually the biggest risk for their child right now is sitting in their room on their phone. They have a much greater risk for cyberbullying, for ostracism, for feeling more depressed and anxious about themselves, and also more at risk for being targeted by predators who are trying to access them and get them to take pictures of themselves and then post that on social media. They're at far greater risk when they're sitting in their bedroom, and yet parents happily let them go up and play on their phone for hours. I mean, some of the data that's coming out now says that the average teen spends 6 hours on various electronic devices a day. No wonder they don't have time to do anything else.
Wow, that's kind of horrifying. You had coined a term. I was talking about bubble wrapping parents and helicopter parents, and you had mentioned a new term that I hadn't heard of.
Yes, snowplow parenting.
Snowplow parenting.
Yeah, we used to call them helicopters because it suggests that they're just hovering above watching. But now what's happened is that if parents don't get an answer they like, or if things aren't moving as quickly as they want, they don't just hover, they plow right through you to get the answer they want, or to go up to someone else who's going to make things happen. People sometimes disparagingly call this younger generation of kids snowflakes. And I've started saying to parents, the more you snowplow your children, the more they're going to become snowflakes to accommodate. And that means that as soon as the temperature goes up, they're going to melt.
So then obviously the hovering, the bubble wrapping, the overprotecting, the protecting them from consequences of their actions, all those things are not working. So what would you say, parents today could do, whether they have, young children, preteens, teens? What would be the best things that parents could do right now to help, change things around and help their children be more resilient, have better mental health, and be able to function better in the world?
Well, I would say the number one thing they need to do is they need to back off and get some support, whether it's counseling or therapy, to help them manage their own anxiety. There's an excellent book by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff called The Coddling of the American Mind. And one of the things they say in there is that children by nature are actually anti-fragile, that our species was designed to be adaptive and cope. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived. And so often what's happening is that parents are doing these things for their children because of their own anxiety and their own worries, rather than the fact that their children aren't by nature competent and capable of learning these things on their own. So I think that's the number one thing. And that, to me, is the hardest step, because if a parent isn't able to look themselves in the mirror and say, maybe I'm contributing to this in some way, maybe I need to change how I'm behaving, then things aren't going to change at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any stories? I want to see if we can have two different kinds of stories. I want to maybe get you to share like a really disaster story of a young person who was, who had snowplow parenting. And then if you can think of a happy story where things got turned around.
Sure. I've got so many stories. I'm just trying to think of the best way to talk about this. So I have so many parents now who want to live in residence with their kids in first year. And of course, those of us who are sort of my age think that would be the most embarrassing thing in the world. But we see parents bringing their teens to campus and the kids on the phone the whole time, and the parents are the ones asking questions and going around and finding out where their children have to go and what they have to do, and that the kids are totally disengaged. And we have parents who drive 3 hours every weekend to come to campus to do their kids' laundry, to do their kids' homework, to make their meals for the next week. And so I have now got what I call my talk, where I say to these parents, I say, I don't mean this badly, and I sure hope this doesn't come to pass anytime soon, but what happens if you get hit by a bus tomorrow? How is your child going to learn how to do these things on their own? And they kind of go, but they might shrink their clothes. Yeah, they might. Once. Well, they may eat junk food. Yes, they might. Well, they might not get an A. Yeah, well, that's true. They might. And I think my saddest story recently was this one mother who drove 3 hours to come down and pick her daughter up from where she lived, which was a 20-minute walk down to campus, to drive her to our office for a 1-hour appointment. And so I said to the mom, I said, wow, like that's a huge part out of your life that you had to take just to bring your daughter. I said, we would have given her a taxi chit to take a taxi here. Oh no, she's never taken a taxi. She'd be too scared. And I said, well, how about the bus? Oh no, she's never taken the bus. I've driven her everywhere her whole life. I said, well, she could have walked. Oh, no, she would have been attacked on the way here. So I said, I had my talk with her, and I said, right now, she's got the biggest safety net possible. We could help, the two of us could work together to help her get over this anxiety, because I said, one day you aren't going to be there to protect her and drive her all the time. And I said, I worry about the impact this is having on your life too. And the mother just said, oh no, I couldn't possibly do that to her. That would cause her too much anxiety. And I sat there thinking to myself, well, actually, whose anxiety is higher here? I think it's actually yours. Mm-hmm. And so this mother was not at all prepared to help empower this young lady to learn how to cope on her own and do things. And I thought, you poor young lady, because how is she going to cope? Because unless mom leaves her a endowment to buy a personal chauffeur that can take her wherever she wants for the rest of her life, eventually she's going to have to learn how to do those things.
But even if mom leaves her, millions of dollars and, personal servants, she'll be like a baby her whole life. She'll be completely incapacitated, and she'll be completely vulnerable to predators and to being exploited, to being manipulated. Like she'll have grown up without any coping strategies, and she'll be completely and utterly vulnerable to anyone who sees how weak she is, and she will be completely preyed upon. So this mother is really, like, she's taking the child's natural resilience and natural, like you said, anti-fragility, and turning this child into this completely helpless, incompetent person who is just, waiting for a disaster to happen.
Yep. And Jean Twenge in her book, iGen, talks about looking at all the research and saying that, in fact, an 18-year-old now is about as emotionally mature and about as competent to do things as a 14-year-old was in 1975. And we would never in a million years have thought of sending a 14-year-old off to college or university. But we've got, in general, a group of kids who haven't had the life experiences that allow them to make their own decisions or function independently, or even be able to identify situations in which they're going to get in trouble because someone always jumped in and rescued them. And they don't know how to manage their own emotions because someone always externally did it for them. And so they get completely overwhelmed when they start feeling negative emotions because they don't know how to cope with them. And I really think that it's no wonder that they're feeling anxious. They've been thrown into this, the middle of the ocean, and nobody told them that the only reason they used to be able to swim is because they had water wings on.
Oh, it's horrifying. Well, let's change the tone. Maybe you can share a happy story, because I think we need a little.
I'll share a happy story of one time when my talk a few years ago. I had a client, and he was going into the first year, and his father had actually taken early retirement, bought a home, and was moving to live with his son, and. So I was seeing the son for another reason, and I asked permission to talk to the dad. So the dad was more than happy to talk with me, and he said, "No, anything I can do at all to help my son be successful, I want to know about it." And I said, "Well, I think you need therapy." He said, "Oh, yes, if I could get therapy to be a better support and advocate for him, I'll do it." I said, "No, you need therapy to learn how to back off and let him do things." He said, "Well, but he never wakes up unless I wake him up, and he never goes, he misses the bus unless I make him do it, and he leaves his lunch unless I take it to him, and he doesn't do his laundry, and he won't do his homework unless I make him or I help him." And I'm thinking, so I said, what's the worst thing that could happen if you don't do those things? Well, he might fail. And I said, "Oh, well, what was your experience like when you went to university?" He said, "Oh, well, he said, gee, I failed out of first year because I was partying and drinking and not going to class and not doing things." And I thought to myself, all right, so this is why you're like this. So I tried to empathize, and I said, "So you're really worried that the same thing could happen to your son and it would be dreadful?" He said, well, actually, no, he said, that was the best experience of my life. That really taught me a valuable lesson because I got kicked out and I had to work in this dead end, low paying job for a year. And every day of that year, I had to show up on time. And I vowed to myself I was never going to have a job like this. So he said, when I went back to school, I worked my rear end off and went to Everett class and became a model student and got a great job. So I said, all right, I'm really confused because you're telling me that something that was the best experience of your life, the most transformative experience, you're not willing to let your son have that sort of experience. Well, he said it was really stressful and hard. So I actually worked with his father quite a bit, and we really he was just, it was really hard for him to let go. And I said, he's not going to learn to do this unless you allow him the chance to make mistakes. As I said, my mother has a saying, which is, why have dog and bark yourself? Like, why would you learn? Yeah, I think it's a great one. Like, why would you learn how to get up and what the consequences are if you know that you don't have to, someone else will always do it for you? Or how are you learn how to set your own limits and do your own homework if someone always jumps in and does it for you? So I hadn't heard from this student or the father for about a year. And then out of the blue, I got a phone call, and it was from the dad. And the dad said, I just want you to know that it was really, really difficult, but I took your advice and I got a counselor and I backed off. And he said, and I even moved out and left my son on his own. And he said, he just graduated and he's got a great job and I couldn't have done it without you.
That's a happy story.
It is a happy story.
Well, it's nice to see that there are, some parents who are willing to, see the truth about what their children need. And I thought it was really remarkable that he could understand that this was such a good experience for himself, but somehow he could not translate it to the child because, it was stressful. And so it's like anything to protect their children from having any negative emotions, right? It's like a negative emotion is going to kill their children. But as you said, these children are online and they're being flooded with really negative emotions. So the parents are kind of clueless because here they are protecting their children from quote unquote stress. And these 6 hours a day they spend online are the most stressful you could possibly imagine. It's so ironic.
It is, I agree with you. It is so ironic. And really, you think about the human body. I mean, we need to be exposed to germs so that we can develop our immune system and develop tolerance. You need to actually put stress on bones to make them grow and to become strong. But if you never let your children harden psychologically or emotionally, then you're turning out kids who are fragile, who can snap under the smallest pressure. I mean, Hera Stroff Morano in her book, A Nation of Whims, sort of talks about hothouse children or teacup teens, that you've got these kids who weren't allowed to have the same sort of hardening experiences that allowed my generation, my parents' generation, to develop that sense of self-esteem and even just coping abilities, learning how to cope with different stresses in your life. And as you said, just learning how to cope with those emotions you have, like all of us. You think about, if you want to become a parent, becoming a parent and having a young kid has to be one of the most, although joyous, really stressful experiences. You've got this little baby who's waking you up, who is completely helpless. You're sleep deprived. If you don't know how to manage your own emotions, how are you going to manage the emotions of this little child who's with you? And who's going to want to hire somebody who doesn't know how to get to work on time and who melts as soon as you give them any sort of constructive criticism, or says, well, you've got to tell me what to do next because I don't know how to do it. I mean, we're not helping them cope with the real expectations of adult life.
A young person I know who was, she was actually very ambitious. She came from Eastern Europe, so she had a much more tough upbringing, right? She had the kind of upbringing you're talking about where she gets hardened. So she was very competent and, in her 20s, but a manager already in this office. And this colleague said to her, "Can I have my daughter go, see you for an interview?" And she said, "Sure." Anyway, the colleague shows up with the kid and is doing all the talking. And my acquaintance had to tell the mother, "Listen, I need you to step out because I have to speak to the daughter." And the daughter was recounting how the mother used to, bring her lunch every day at her previous job before the child got fired. And, because of course she got fired because she couldn't function. So, apparently these young people are having a much harder time maintaining their jobs because they get fired because they are just incapable of doing what's necessary.
Yeah. Well, and if you spent your life with people always doing for you, then there's just the expectation that once you go out in the workplace, they'll do the same thing, that they'll accommodate the fact that you're late, that they'll accommodate the fact that you're spending 6 hours on your phone rather than doing the work that was assigned to you, that they'll accommodate you taking a long lunch because you forgot to bring it from home. And that's not really how the world works at the moment.
Hopefully never. Yeah. And I also heard that these young people, because their parents talk to them like they're pals, they don't know how to deal with authority, and they don't know how to show proper deference to their supervisors, to their bosses, to people who are in positions of authority who have, say over their future. So they get themselves into trouble because they have what's called a quote unquote a bad attitude.
Right. Well, it's not a bad attitude. It's a learned attitude. It's that I'm on the same level as you. I'm, because starting from when I was little, my parents weren't in charge. So I was just, that my parents, this is what they learn is that I get to dictate everything that goes on. I get to decide. I'm so important that if I don't want to eat what everyone is eating, mom will make me a separate meal. That I'm so important that if I leave my lunch, that instead of having to live with the consequences, someone will deliver it to me. So that doesn't, it actually breeds people who are more self-centered and more individualistic. And that makes it harder for a society to function. If you've got people who it's all about me and my needs, and that, why would I listen to you? You're not an authority. And that's, so well, science says that, but I know better because that's not my opinion.
So that's where you have all these people who are, saying that COVID is a hoax and they don't need masks, because it sounds like it's kind of coming from the same attitude, right? Yeah,
well, yes. Yeah, it is. And then the other thing that I don't know how much longer we've got, but the other thing that I really see a huge rise in is, and I know you've written a little bit about this, is the idea that parents want to make sure they want some sort of a shield for their kids and a sword to make sure that they're going to be able to succeed. And so there's been this rise of parents wanting to get their kids labeled as having a disability because they see that as a way to ensure success. What I'm sure most of your listeners have heard about the college admission scandal that was down in the States. And what they may not realize is that the actual linchpin, like the key component to that, was that William Singer told all of these clients, the first thing we need to do is we need to get your child falsely diagnosed with a learning disability so they can get double time on the SATs. And I mean, in the States now, it's become such a problem that the media calls it the rich kids loophole, that they figured out. And in fact, Singer says, I'm going to quote this. He says, yeah, everywhere around the country, what's happened is all the wealthy families figured out that if I get my kid tested and they get extended time, they can do better on tests. So most of these kids don't even have issues, but they're getting time. The playing field is not fair. So they've learned kids who have a learning disability really do need some extra time in order to read and process information. But there's tons of studies to show that if you're not disabled and you get extra time, you actually do better than your peers who are writing up in regular time. And so this has become the new, I don't want to say scam, but the new plow on the snowplow that parents can use, because once your kid is labeled with a disability, not only do they get the extra time, which helps them have a competitive advantage over their peers, but it also gives them this shield of protection, because if anybody tries to take it away or do something, you can threaten a human rights complaint. And so schools back off, teachers back off, and they just shrug their shoulders and say, they got someone to label their kid with a disability. We can't do anything now. And the psychologist or the doctor says they need these things, so I guess we got to give it to them.
Well, they could very simply retest them with an independent assessor who is going to actually come to the truth. That would be one simple solution.
Well, and you know what? Probably, in your lifetime and my lifetime, we've lived through an era where it used to be that if you gave opinions frivolously, you could be called to court to have to defend your opinion, and it would be pretty embarrassing if it was shown that you came to this conclusion out of a bias or an advocacy stance. But that doesn't happen anymore, and schools don't want to have the expense of saying, "Hey, we're going to have all these kids retested." I mean, right now there are some colleges in Ontario where 20% of their students are getting accommodated for a disability of some sort. Well, once you've got 20% of the population saying they're disabled, it's no longer a disability. That's just normal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
I have a real problem with this because, I spend my days these days doing assessments. That's most of what I do, and doing something called paper reviews, which is reviewing files of people who are on disability. And what I see over and over again is people being misdiagnosed constantly, so much of this going on. And it's really horrifying, because what happens is when people get misdiagnosed, they don't get the proper treatment. And of course, they end up staying off work for years, when if they only just got properly diagnosed, they could get the proper treatment and get back into their lives. So I have a real problem with people being misdiagnosed, whether, overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. And to me, I feel very proud that I can say, okay, it's not this, it's that. And, because it's truth, right? It's facts. Yeah. And so I feel, so good doing the job I do, because it's clearing up all the muck, right? And I feel like these children who are misdiagnosed, it's not serving them either, because they're walking around with this victim mentality, and they're always having an excuse to fail. And having an excuse to fail is a terrible, terrible thing to do to your child.
Well, it's not even an excuse to fail. It's a safety net to make sure they don't fail, because what's happened is now if you've got a child who's been labeled with a disability who starts to not get A's, well, then it means that the school isn't doing enough to accommodate them. So you've got to do more. So now in the elementary and secondary school panel, and it's moving up to colleges, what they've discovered is if you've got someone who still can't get A's or B's with the accommodations in place, then they give them memory aids. So I've had students who had been able to bring in 6 pages of double-sided cheat sheet notes to every test and exam, and they don't have a memory disability, but it was just another way to sort of say, we're going to make sure you pass. And it comes back to the same issue that we're both talking about, is that it's not giving these kids realistic feedback about what they can and cannot do. And I think it does a huge disservice and harm to students when you tell them, oh, you've got a memory problem. And they're astounded when I say to them and I show them their results and I say, in fact, your memory is just fine. There's nothing wrong with your memory. Well, but I need those memory aids because I do better when I have them. Well, yes, that's true. But everyone in your class would do better if they could bring in 6 pages of double-sided cheat sheet notes to their exams. But we had just recently a student who, at the end of testing, we said, you don't really have a disability. And she said, well, I know that. But she said, my mom told me I should get diagnosed when I was in school, because she was at an expensive private school. And she said, well, because mom said, well, everyone else is doing it and they're all getting accommodations and they're getting better marks. So you need to do that too. And it gets to be this nuclear arms race where everybody says, well, I've got to do it because everyone else is doing it.
When I was in one of my training programs, there was a cheating thing going on. And some of my classmates were, because the exams were staggered through the year. So some of my classmates were speaking to other students who had the exams earlier, and they were getting copies of the exams. So I knew that there were classmates of mine who were cheating on the tests, and that they were getting, really good marks because they had the questions in advance. And I suppose I could have, joined in with these cheaters, but I always wanted to know what I knew. I always wanted to do the work because I felt like I would be ripping myself off. If I cheated, I wouldn't be learning the material I needed to know in order to be competent in my job. So I just let them do what they were doing. I mean, I wasn't going to go blowing whistles because I knew where that was going to take me. But I just stepped aside and I just did my studying and I wrote my tests, and I did fine. And those students who cheated, I always felt like they hurt themselves because they didn't have to do the work and they didn't have to learn. And so for the rest of their career, they would be missing essential knowledge and essential skills that I had done the work for. So I feel like, I came out ahead. They might have gotten better grades, but I came out ahead because I learned what I needed to learn. And I just felt like I always feel bad for people who cheat because I think that they do lose because they don't learn what they need to learn in order to really feel truly confident. They know that they've cheated. They know that they're, missing out deep down inside.
Yeah. Well, and as you said, you don't want to have a professional who's one of the examples I give is, you don't want to have your neurosurgeon going, oh, I cheated on that section. I can't really remember how you put that aneurysm. Jeez, I don't have a cheat sheet to that either. Rats. I want that person to actually know how to do it and be able to perform under pressure because they really learned it, not that they just sort of cheated or memorized it. But it's interesting that you say that because there was a book. I'm trying to. I think it's by David Callahan, and it was The Culture of Cheating, and that was way back in the early 2000s. But he wrote a book sort of saying that, in fact, younger people, at least at that time, didn't characterize that behavior as cheating. They just framed it as a way to game the system and get a leg up. And so that's, I think, what I see is happening is that people aren't framing this as cheating. They just say, this is a way to get ahead in this competitive society. It's a way for me to take advantage of a loophole that's there that allow me to do better. And it's too bad, but you've got a system that allows that to happen, and you've got parents who can pay. I mean, in some places, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 for an assessment. Well, there's an implicit expectation that if you've paid that much money, you're going to get a product you asked for. And we did a study a few years ago where we surveyed over 100 clinicians in Ontario who do this type of assessment work, and asked them a number of questions. And it was really scary to me that 75% of the people who took part in the survey said that they thought the purpose of doing a psychoeducational assessment was to demonstrate that their client needed accommodations. And 14% actually admitted that they would lie about the disability status of their client in order to get them the accommodations they wanted.
Oh, well, this
and so that's the type of stuff that you're doing in your paper reviews too. Is people who see themselves as advocates for their client, and yes. There's nothing bad about you want people in your corner. My gosh, if I'm ever accused of something, I want a lawyer who is my advocate and in my corner. But it causes you to not only have confirmatory bias, but it gives you blinders, and I think puts you in a dual relationship where you feel that you have to give them what they want because they're your client and they're paying for the service.
Yeah, I'm spending a lot of my time seeing how the person get an assessment and then they're treated by the same person who's assessed them. So of course, the person is going to say things that, are based in that confirmatory bias. So I'm constantly trying to find the objective facts. I'm trying to piece through things, and I spend my life with that. And I feel like, wow, we could have a whole conversation for like an hour just about, these kinds of conflicts of interest of people in the helping professions, whether it's, psychologists or psychiatrists or lawyers or doctors who are, who are quote unquote serving their clients, but really not serving them because they're labeling them inappropriately. And these people are being put into these categories that aren't real. So we could have a whole other conversation, but I guess not for today.
Good. Just invite me back another time, because I agree with you. I think it really, as we said before, it doesn't do them any service. And more than that, often it robs them of the treatment they need for the real problem. I see so many young people who've been told they have post-concussive syndrome, and no one's explained to them that what that means is that actually your brain is healed from the concussion you had, but now you've got a lot of psychological problems that have all snowballed to cause you all these other things. And so let's treat those symptoms. Let's treat the anxiety that you have and your family has. Let's treat the depression you've got. Let's treat the over-focusing on your physical symptoms and catastrophizing. And let's get you exercising again, because you're not exercising. So but instead of doing that, they've just given them this label that, as you said, and we've been talking about, incapacitates them and puts them in the victim role, but also makes them feel helpless and hopeless. There's nothing I can do. I have to rely on everyone else because I've got this, problem that could be there for the rest of whatever, and there's nothing I can do to take some agency or responsibility to get better. Like that, to me, what a disservice to that client.
It's very, very sad. And, I remember growing up and I would play outside with my friends. We were all outside all the time, running around, skateboarding, biking, doing all sorts of crazy stuff and falling down a lot. And our parents, thank goodness, just let us do everything. And I feel like I was so lucky to be able to just be allowed to have that free play and learn all the different, skills on negotiating with my peers and grow up with some strength and some confidence. And I feel like that free play outside probably gave me at least as much as my parents and my school did. And in terms of just developing my character and enabling me to be a competent adult. And I feel so bad for these young people today who are being really crippled by all these terrible attitudes that are supposedly there to help them, but really are harming them so much.
Yeah, I agree with you. And there's lots of research to say that free play teaches you all those skills that you were just talking about. It teaches you about how to negotiate and how to be aware of the feelings of the other people you're playing with, because you don't want to piss them off so they leave and you're all by yourself. It teaches you really good visual spatial skills about figuring out, do I have enough space to run through those trees, or how hard is that? How hard do I have to throw that? And it gives you some outdoor play and exercise, which a lot of kids don't get these days. And it just gives you a way to learn how to manage your own time and structure your own time rather than having someone always do it for you. I think that those are the types of things that if parents could back off, that would be helpful. And learning just to sort of say, my child, trying to sort of maybe put up a little sticky that says, my child is more capable this week than they were last week. And so give them more responsibility, give them more freedom, give them a chance to demonstrate that they've learned those things. And if they don't learn it, give them realistic consequences, or give them some support in learning how to do it so they can do it better next time. Give them chores. Doesn't have to be big chores, but that gives them the message that actually you are part of this family and all of us have to work together. It's not that we just serve your needs because you exist. And it gives you life lessons that will help you function on the real world. And have dinner together, for goodness sakes, like where nobody has their electronics out. Have a conversation, find out what happened in everyone's lives, find out what they learned today that's new and exciting. I mean, those are all things that really help kids learn about what happens in the real world and how to interact with people rather than just online.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, our time is almost up, so I was just wanting to ask you, where can people find you if they're interested in, reading about the things that you're working on these days?
You can find me at the Regional Assessment and Resource Center at Queen's University. It's pretty easy. If you just look up Allyson Harrison at Queen's, and my name is spelled with a Y because my father didn't know how to spell. Anyway, but I'm easy to find, and I run the Regional Assessment and Resource Center, and we're on Twitter and Facebook as well. So that's where you can find us.
And finally, a little quick call to action. I know you've given lots of suggestions, but something you can just leave the listeners with at the end.
Trust that your kids are anti-fragile. Get help. Find some other people who feel the same way and can be a support group to allow you to all work together to give your kids some freedom. If you look at countries in Europe, like Germany, I mean, they have restaurants where the kids just go outside and play in the playground and there are no parents watching them. And those kids all manage to survive and function. And as you said, there's lots of research to say that kids who come from different countries and are immigrants to Canada who have parents who think differently, they actually seem to be doing better emotionally and psychologically and academically because they've developed those resiliency skills like you talked about with the 20-year-old young lady who was the manager. Because they were given the freedom to learn how to take charge of their own lives and to make their own decisions, they actually become more functional people. And that's what we need. We really need to help our young people be able to function effectively in this world. Because one day, God forbid, hopefully not too soon, their parents aren't going to be around to do it for them.
Well, thank you so much. This is such an important conversation to have. And, now in these stressful times, it can't be repeated enough, so I really appreciate you coming back on the show and sharing all this valuable information with everyone. And I think that this is the kind of podcast that people should be sharing with all their friends because it's crucial.
Yeah, well, thanks. This has been just a lovely conversation. Thanks, Marcia.
My pleasure. All the best.
Thank you very much.
That was the brilliant Allyson Harrison, and I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. If you like this podcast, please review it wherever you listen, and you can sign up for my free bi-weekly wellness newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll also learn about my new online courses and my YouTube series on coping with COVID and moving into spring with good self-care.